Hi, I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
In this video, we'll tell you everything you need to know about why these Olympics are
The Tokyo 2020 Olympics are starting today, and they shouldn't be. So we're going to do a rundown of all of the red flags that were ignored to get us to this point and explain all of the ridiculousness surrounding the Tokyo Olympics. Or, as they're known in Japanese,
This will be Tokyo's second time hosting the Olympics, the first being in 1964, which Japan looks back on as the time when they were able to showcase everything that the nation had accomplished in the short decades since the end of World War II. Now, many were hoping that the 2020 Olympics would serve a similar function and show the world what Japan is made of today. And to them we say, be careful what you wish for.
The Tokyo 2020 Olympics is based on two fundamental falsehoods. Well, three if you count the 2020 bit.
The first of those is that hot, sweaty Tokyo summers would be suitable for being outside while alive, let alone being outside, alive, and trying to run real fast. The second is that the Olympics would be good for Japan.
Tokyo won its Olympic bid back in 2013, coincidentally the year in which I was awarded a full scholarship to go and study in Japan. So at that time I already knew that Japan was willing to throw large amounts of money on pointless international projects.
Now, Japan won that bid with a presentation that focused on the uniquely Japanese concept of omotenashi, a complex, completely untranslatable word with no English equivalent that means hospitality.
And this was followed by a huge boom in pre-Olympic hype building based entirely on the idea that the whole world was in love with Japan, which allowed some cynical foreign opportunists to cash in.
I wrote a whole book.
To cash in with lucrative book deals.
And also regular book deals.
There was a genuine sense the Olympics was going to be good for the country, a moment to show that Japan was a progressive, forward-thinking, international nation. It went through a phase of patting itself on the back so hard you'd think that there was some New Year's mochi stuck in its throat.
But amid the hype, people noticed that there may have been some slight bending of the truth involved in clinching the bid in the first place. For example, the assertion that Tokyo, which sees temperatures like this, was known for its mild summers.
Yeah, Tokyo summers are mild in the same way that the sentence, Tokyo summers are mild, is mildly bullshit.
Measurements were taken for the Tokyo Olympic Marathon course, the original one, and in a paper called Microclimate Variation and Estimated Heat Stress of Runners in the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Marathon, the conclusion was that the entire course was an extreme danger to everyone running on it.
As preparation for the Olympics began, a contest was held to decide on the official logo, and the winning submission was designed by Belgian artist Olivier Deby.
Quick correction there, Ollie, that logo was actually submitted by designer Kenjiro Sano.
Yes, well, Sano may have submitted it, but it was designed by this Belgian chap.
Luckily, while Tokyo scrambled to come up with a new, better logo, the public was distracted by a different design, that of the Olympic Stadium. The ambitious plan by architect Zaha Hadid made headlines when it broke the bank before it ever broke ground.
Hadid's $2.3 billion design was so outrageously overpriced, you'd expect it to come topped with a ketchup Hello Kitty drawn by a maid cafe waitress.
The Japanese people wanted the Olympics, but not at any cost. So local architect Kengo Kuma was brought in to cut costs, which he promptly achieved by choosing to leave out some of the more dispensable stadium features, like the platform that houses the sacred Olympic flame. In his defense, his design was cheaper because it was largely constructed of wood, and including the sacred Olympic flame would have made it a fire code violation. And I think we all know that when Japan has to choose between some hollow Olympic symbolism and the safety of its people, it will always choose heavy-handed narrative foreshadowing.
Speaking of Japan putting the rickshaw before the guy who pulls the rickshaw, Japan was confronted with a different problem of whether it had the infrastructure to cope with an influx of an additional 10 million tourists.
Some analysts projected that the city would be short 14,000 hotel rooms per day, and other analysts bought a whole bunch of stock in Airbnb.
Startups frantically tried to fill the gaps. I remember at the time reporting for the radio on an app that allowed any restaurant or office space to rent out a small corner of their real estate to anybody with a smartphone and a suitcase.
So if you were, say, a tourist with a late check-in, or a terrorist organization looking to coordinate a citywide bombing, There was an app for that.
But those kind of concerns were going to have to wait because Japan was more interested in far more important things, like mascots with futuristic looks, a happy anime vibe, and colours like samurai blue and sakura pink. The mascots were chosen to be accessible to not only the Japanese population, but also international fans too. And that's why they gave them such easy to pronounce names, such as
Samito.
Muratowa.
Samighty. Some Itwai?
As the years drew close to 2020 and Japan realised that the rest of the world wasn't getting into the necessary Olympic spirit by reversing generations of man-made climate change and helping to drop the temperature of Tokyo by a few degrees, Plan B kicked in, which was to acknowledge that holding events like the marathon in Tokyo would be a death march.
That's right. Making professional athletes run a marathon in Tokyo heat would be as medically irresponsible as making Ollie run a marathon.
Organisers had no choice but to move the Olympic marathon to Sapporo in Hokkaido because it was the only other location in Japan that satisfied the necessary conditions of being cool enough to run a marathon and having a vibrant enough prostitution industry for the spectators.
So this takes us through to January of 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic hit.
Back then, it looked to the outside world that Japan had a really good handle of the COVID crisis. Its numbers were considerably lower than other comparable countries in the region. And a cynic might say that Japan deliberately suppressed infection numbers so it didn't have to postpone the Olympics.
To be clear, we are not saying that Japan has a history of massaging numbers for its own purposes, but we did get our hands on this exclusive video.
But even with minimal testing and possible misclassification of COVID deaths, those suspiciously low numbers were on the rise. And all of a sudden, the prospect of the whole country catching Olympic fever sounded bad.
So the Olympics were rescheduled for the following year, and Japan devoted itself to spending that time eradicating the coronavirus so they'd be sure that they were ready for just kidding. They repeated a cycle of rushed, toothless half measures by enacting 3 states of emergency that they consistently ended too early so it would look like they could still host the Olympics.
At the time, domestic media was generally towing the party line, but cracks were starting to show in this blanket coverage of positivity for the Olympics. The Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan at the time tried to show the undeniable link between COVID and the Olympics.
They did that by adorning the cover of their newspaper with this brilliantly clever amalgamation of the virus's genetic structure and the Tokyo Olympics logo.
Now, even though under trademark law this is clearly allowed under fair use or some parody exception, Tokyo did not like it, and they tried to suppress it by threatening legal action, saying that their original design had been plagiarized. No, the other original design. No, not that one. The other original design. I can see how they got confused.
Now, while all this was happening, there were also bribery investigations that turned up a whole bunch of shady money changing hands. But we're not going to discuss that, because this video is about why the Tokyo Olympics are fucked, and not why all of the Olympics are fucked.
Japan spent $4 million in bribes to win the Olympics. Suga, allegedly, when collecting one of the bribes, said, "We need the money to buy the Africans."
Jake, we said we're not going to talk about it.
Then, one of the bigwigs in the Tokyo Olympic Organizing Committee, this dude, Yoshiro Mori, said that Olympic organizing meetings dragged on because of the tendency of women to speak. Ironically, in saying so, he may have made a decent point about the wisdom of keeping one's mouth shut.
Ultimately, criticism of his sexist comments forced his resignation. But, in his defense, he is a really old Japanese guy, and so he may have just been surprised to find out the women in the room weren't there to serve him tea. Then, a few days later, while brainstorming ideas for the Olympic ceremony...
Wait, when was this?
Mid-March 2021.
That's when they started brainstorming for a major international event that was scheduled for 4 months out, but also scheduled for 8 months prior.
Oh, hang on, Bobby, it gets worse, because this was the very meeting in which Tokyo Olympic creative chief Sasaki Hiroshi floated the idea of having, get this, plus-size celeb Watanabe Naomi dress up as a pig and fly through the air for the opening ceremonies. Now, obviously this got rejected, but in his defense, maybe he'd heard us describing the conditions we thought would be necessary in order for Japan to host a successful Olympics.
We often hear that Japan is ranked 120 out of 156 countries for gender equality, and these remarks from both Mori and Sasaki show us that there is still deeply entrenched misogyny in this society. So the Olympics may be putting Japanese culture, Japanese development, all of the things that Japan can do on the world stage, but they have also put these embarrassing remarks and Japan's misogyny on the world stage for all to see.
These back-to-back offenses led hundreds of Olympic volunteers to quit, which shows you just how upset they must have been, because you really have to go out of your way to quit something you A, don't get paid for, and B, haven't started doing yet.
Now, here's where, despite Japanese public opposition to the Olympics growing, the government found it really difficult to change course.
Once a Japanese organization has decided on a path forward, it's very, very difficult to get it to change direction. Because making any change or even canceling that planned action means that the person who put it forward in the first place is going to lose face, and nobody wants that to happen.
While that's definitely true, the Japanese were spared the trouble of not changing course this time by the IOC and men like Dick Pound, who would never have even given them the option to fail to act.
Bobby, this gentleman's name is Dick Pound. Should we take a pick at this low-hanging fruit?
No, because low-hanging fruit is clearly a balls metaphor. And the only thing that I will say about his name is that one time Dick Pound called the pandemic the elephant in the room, and honestly, dude, if your name is Dick Pound, you need to refer to the elephant in the room as the other elephant in the room.
Right, no more Dick Pound jokes. Let's talk about the contract between Tokyo and the IOC, which permitted Dick Pound to bend Tokyo over a barrel.
According to the host city contract for the Tokyo Olympics, only the IOC has the right to cancel the games, and if Tokyo refuses to hold them, it may need to provide compensation for the damages incurred by the IOC.
Ollie, you also have some expertise here. How many law degrees do you have again?
Depends who's asking, but 2.5.
And what's your legal opinion on this contract?
Oh, it's
And that's why the Olympics barreled ahead. Now, you can't have the Olympics without the symbolic passing of the flame from the Olympic homeland of Greece to the shores of Japan. So nothing was going to stop the torch relay, not even the cancellation of the Greek leg of the torch relay.
Wait, what?
I do believe we have a picture of what the Greek leg would have looked like. Let's pull that up.
No, Bobby. Now, Japan was intent on continuing with the Olympic relay as a symbol, as a gesture, as a forerunner of what the Olympics could be. And we think it did a great job, given that they managed, in this event, to create a COVID cluster among the individuals whose job it was to enforce social distancing.
I really hate to use that old cliched simile, but it is exactly like when a fire station burns down, and then you find out that the fire station's fire insurance pays out to Dick Pound.
As the pandemic was stretching Japan's medical infrastructure to breaking point, with already overworked frontline workers risking their lives to keep the virus at bay, Tokyo requested 10,000 medical personnel stop doing that and be on call for the Olympics. Now, medical workers all across Japan would have been super offended by this request if they weren't already busy being even more offended by the fact they were requested to do it for free.
To add to the accumulation of bad press, IOC chairman, I believe it's pronounced Baka, popped up at a press conference to say that holding the Tokyo Olympics during the coronavirus pandemic would require sacrifices. You know, like the athletes might have to sacrifice their trip to Akihabara, and the local Japanese residents might have to sacrifice their grandparents.
Public opposition was growing, and at one point, polls showed that 83% of the Japanese population were against the Olympics going ahead as planned. 83%! Japan hasn't been that united in its opposition to something since I tried to wear shoes in its house.
Seriously though, the onslaught of Olympic headlines kind of made it seem like they were actively trying to increase opposition. For example,
while Japan was struggling with its vaccine supply and was in the low single digits for the percentage of the elderly population who had even had their first vaccination, they announced plans to give free vaccinations to all of the Olympic volunteers before the rest of the population. Now, an obvious solution to this problem of protecting the elderly population as planned while also making sure that volunteers were vaccinated would have simply been to institute a minimum 65-year requirement for all volunteers. This would have had the additional benefit of showcasing to the world Japan's largest natural resource, the elderly.
Next, at a time when the government had restricted the sale of alcohol at bars and restaurants and was actively calling on the public to refrain from eating and drinking out, it announced that the Olympic venues would be serving alcohol, in a decision that was so reviled by the public that even Olympic sponsor Asahi Beer was like, hey, you know what pairs well with rhythmic gymnastics? A Kirin.
Speaking of ill-advised sponsorship decisions, the government, worried about low turnout at the Olympic events, started asking elementary schools to populate the stands with children on mandatory school trips.
And, in some cases, they provided strict instructions to make sure that when those children got thirsty, they quenched that thirst with Coca-Cola products. Coca-Cola, the official sponsor of giving children COVID.
Some suspected that if the government just continued to plough ahead with their plans, the public would eventually catch up and just resign themselves to the Games and get into the Olympic spirit. And sure enough, once the athletes started to arrive, we did start to see some positivity, mostly in terms of their PCR test results.
Yes, in fact, the second team into the country, the Ugandan team, despite being fully vaccinated with AstraZeneca jabs, had 2 team members test positive for COVID once in country.
Japan swiftly and thoroughly isolated the Ugandan team, and the Japanese populace kept itself thoroughly and unconditionally socially distanced from them. We thought this could be a model for coronavirus response worldwide. We reached out to the administration for comment, and their response was, wait, those guys have COVID?
Shortly after, a member of the Serbian rowing team and members of other Olympic delegations tested positive. A cluster broke out at a hotel where Brazilian athletes were staying. Although it's possible that the cluster was unrelated to the athletes, and we're not even being sarcastic here. It could have just been from the massive 5th wave of COVID infections that Tokyo was experiencing.
This massive spike forced Tokyo's hand, and with just 2 weeks to go before the Olympics, Tokyo initiated its 4th state of emergency. Now, when you think of an emergency, you think of a moment in time where you're uniquely as a human having to push your mental and physical limits. So in a way, it would have been a nice opportunity for non-athletes too to get in the Olympic spirit.
But in the toothless, ineffective way that Japan actually operates a state of emergency, the word emergency is doing so much heavy lifting that it's practically a lock for the gold medal in the clean and jerk.
So at this point, numerous Olympians were classified as having been in close contact with someone who had COVID. And so after months of promising they had detailed plans to stop the spread of COVID at the Olympics, Japan announced they were working on a way to allow these potentially infected athletes to compete anyway.
That's like me swearing to Brian here that I won't sleep with his wife, but then telling him that I am working on a plan to allow her to sleep with me.
What plan?
It involves you dying of COVID.
Calls for cancellation continued, and former Prime Minister Mario stuck his head up to say A, his bowels were fine, thanks for asking, and B, anyone that is anti-Olympics is anti-Japan, expecting us to believe that damaging Japan's economy, public health, and international reputation is the pro-Japan position.
But despite the best efforts of Super Mario ulcers over here, the decision was finally reached to hold the Olympics without spectators, which guaranteed that the Tokyo Olympics would go down in history as the first ever Olympics to not actually financially benefit the host country. Oops, I said that wrong. I should have said the first spectatorless Olympics to not actually financially benefit the host country.
But it had to be done, as Olympic chief Baka made clear in a press conference, where he said the most important thing was the safety of the Japanese people. Or to use his words, the Chinese people.
Most importantly, also for the Japanese people.
In his defense, Japan and China are countries that are easy to confuse due to everything they have in common. Just to pick one example, both countries should not be hosting the Olympics.
And let's not forget that Tokyo knew it shouldn't be hosting the Olympics, which was further reinforced by reports that with just days to go, the Olympic swimming venue for the triathlon was smelling like a toilet. And no, not one of those super hygienic space-age Japanese toilets, a good old-fashioned squatty potty.
Why was it smelling like a squatty potty? Because Tokyo doesn't have separate drainage systems for rainwater and sewage, and after heavy rains, untreated sewage floods into Tokyo Bay. So it's probably a good thing that they didn't schedule the Olympics for right after rainy season. Oh wait, they did, because just like the lanes where athletes are probably doing the butterfly right now, the people who pitched Tokyo as a venue are full of
Then, on practically the eve of the Olympic opening ceremony, one of the close contact Ugandan team members failed to hand in his daily saliva sample. He straight up vanished from his hotel, leaving a note saying that he wanted to stay and live and work in Japan. Now, obviously, this is a big policy failure. It's a big "I told you so" moment for the anti-Olympic brigade. And if he's got COVID, obviously pretty bad for public health. However, maybe, just maybe, this might be the silver lining to this whole story.
Yes, because no matter how badly Japan continues to screw up, misguided non-Japanese people, like us, will still forgive it, will still yearn for it, even fall in love with it. We don't know how many medals Japan will claim this time around, but in a way, it kind of seems like Japan can't lose. And there is one thing that we sincerely agree with supporters of the Olympics on, and that's this.
If there's anything positive that can come out of this whole mess, it's that the Olympics truly have given a chance to hard-working young men and women from all around the world to come here to Japan to make their dreams come true.
If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us which Japan issue you'd like to see us take on next.
And you can find us doing similar stuff on our weekly podcast, Japan by River Cruise, where we do weekly reporting on the Japanese river cruise industry and this kind of stuff too. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.